Hey YouTubers, and welcome back to a Underworld discussion video. Now, I haven't necessarily covered this franchise for a pretty long time, honestly, but it is something I kind of wanted to get out there. I did kind of briefly cover this a couple months ago, but it's just something I wanted to do, a little bit more of a solo video, a solo discussion, just kind of opening up a conversation for anyone who's remotely interested as much as I am. Now, before I get into this and whether or not I actually think they're actually going to make an Underworld 6, because, spoiler alert, I don't necessarily think it just doesn't look like it's going to happen, honestly. If we look at the box office numbers from this year alone, I mean, obviously they went in with the idea that they weren't going to make a ton of money in the domestic market. They didn't even push it as hard as some of the other films in the franchise. And with that being said, with the way they did do it, $30 million gross domestically wasn't necessarily the bad thing here, but the $50 million internationally to only make around $81 million worldwide at the end of its run is a little bit disappointing. I'm sure that is a really big disappointment, considering the fact that it was basically almost around half of what they made with the fourth film, Underworld Awakening. So I can imagine that they were a bit disappointed there, but at the same time, they only ever did spend about half of it in the initial production of it. Whether or not they actually made up for that in the marketing, I'm not necessarily sure. So it is still up in the air, still up in whether or not Sony actually did make a profit on this film. And to just kind of put it into more of a perspective, when I did cover this last, I did talk about not only Underworld but also Resident Evil, as a matter of fact. And since that video, we've actually gotten confirmation that they are making a Resident Evil reboot with James Wan set to produce the film, but we don't necessarily know who the creative team is other than James Wan is working on this, which, for what it's worth, he is an amazing director. He's amazing talent in the horror industry, and he's also an emerging talent in the blockbuster industry. So, I mean, who really knows? I'm really excited for that. I've always been a huge fan of both of these franchises, but this video is about the Underworld franchise, in general. And before I go on any further, before this movie came out, I mean, years before this movie came out, they were talking about potentially doing a spinoff with Theo James's character, David, which I guess he came out earlier and said that he didn't necessarily want to do it. And honestly, just reading some of the interviews that we got from him up before this film basically came out, it just didn't seem like he was really that interested. So I wouldn't necessarily put that too much stock in it. Although at the time I could imagine, I definitely think a lot of people would have imagined that it would have been pretty cool to have a male-centric character for this franchise, although I understand the fact that a lot of people do like this franchise because it is kind of a female-centric, female heroine person with Kate Beckinsale. And when they tried to kind of get away from her in the third film, that film really didn't perform very well, at least domestically at the time. And when they brought her back for the fourth film, it really seemed like a lot of people weren't really interested in the Underworld movies unless Kate Beckinsale were to be at the very forefront of the series. And with that being said, all the talk about a Theo James spinoff or, even a potential fifth or sixth film starring him, doesn't necessarily make sense financially to me. I don't necessarily think they're actually going to do that. Now, there was also some talk about them doing some kind of a television show dealing with the Eternal War and everything like that. That was probably going to be foreignly produced, and something more akin to the Transporter series that we got a couple years back. I'm not even sure if that show is still on, so tell me in the comment section below if that show is even still on, because I have no earthly idea. I wanted to watch it, but I just kind of assumed, it just kind of got into my head that it wasn't really worth getting all excited about. So make sure to tell me that in the comment section below. But so I don't necessarily even see the television show happening at this point, although, with Lynn Wiseman, he's basically kind of become more of a television personality more than a blockbuster filmmaker. He did some really good movies, but, with the whole Total Recall reboot, just didn't really pan out very well. And if you guys remember, even just years ago, before the recent Mummy movie came out, Alex Kurtzman's The Mummy came out this year, he was actually originally attached to direct that film, and he basically got away from it. And even though that was kind of a relief to a lot of people, I've always kind of liked, Lynn Wiseman's directorial, philosophy, or the way he actually puts things together. I think one of the things is he's kind of bogged down with every bit of a franchise blockbuster of horror making, or not just blockbuster filmmaking situation where you get bogged down, so you have to kind of go with the flow and go with the punches. You don't necessarily get to develop your own world. But when we look at the original 2 Underworld movies, I actually really liked what he was doing with those films, and I'm really glad that he actually kind of built this world and kind of made it his own, even though they've basically gotten a lot away from that concept, other than, with the third film going backwards, and then these last 2 films basically either introducing way too much philosophy, not enough philosophy, and ignoring essential vital parts of each other. But this isn't necessarily a review. So just to kind of break it down, I don't necessarily see Theo James becoming a main protagonist of this film series. I don't necessarily see him actually doing a 6th film, sans Kate Beckinsale, sans everyone else. I definitely don't think that he has the stomach for it. I just never really saw it in any of his interviews that I actually read or got to see up when Blood Wars was actually coming out. And at the same time, I don't necessarily see Kate Beckinsale coming back for this film. I don't necessarily see her, because she has always been fighting this every step of the way. I know she might be passionate about it. This is kind of the same way the Resident Evil films were, where Mila Jovovich and also Paul W.S. Anderson were actually kind of married at the time. It was more kind of a family project of them working on these things together every couple of years, and just a way to kind of keep them involved. It might be the same thing, although, with Lynn Wiseman not actually directing these movies, it might be the same thing with Kate Beckinsale coming back to this. Plus, the matter of fact, her career hasn't necessarily taken off as much as it actually should have. So I'm always kind of really happy to see her in these movies, but at the same time, I really want her to just spread her wings and do other things. And she's been kind of, I guess, a little bit apprehensive to that. She feels like she's been kind of the sexual figure with these movies long enough, and she doesn't necessarily want to do any, I guess, superhero movies that she's talked about. So maybe she keeps coming back to these because these are her superhero films. So we never necessarily know whether or not she's actually going to be coming back to this franchise, and I don't necessarily think so, honestly, if I have to be completely 100% honest. But that really leaves us no television show, no Theo James sequel spinoff, no Kate Beckinsale, maybe, unless she's kind of in a mentoring role and it actually is the next generation type of situation. But I definitely think if they're going to do another one of these, and I really think they should, because even though this wasn't a very successful film, the Blood Wars, the last one, I don't necessarily think it was so much of a flop that Sony wouldn't be okay with doing this, especially with Sony's track record as of late. They have not had an incredibly successful movie in the last couple of years, so having even a minor success is going to be good enough for them to actually put a new movie into development, at least at some point. I mean, that's what we saw with the Resident Evil films, and that's what we saw going into this particular year. So this might have been a small financial success for them. They're going to actually probably put one out if they even decide to. I mean, still up in the wall, we have no earthly idea, but what would it be? I think we'd have to explore, Eve, Celine's daughter's character, because one of the things that Blood War really did is it basically cleaned the slate. Celine's character arc is completely done. They've written that off, but then they left us with that little scene at the very end that's just so mesmerizing for anyone who's been a fan of this franchise actually for as long as I have, where you want them to keep continuing the story. You want to see what that meeting was about. You want to see everything that they talked about and everything that that's going to lead to. And I know that's what that was there for. I know what they're planning is having a Eve movie kind of take over, kind of letting the actress, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but having her basically age into the role where she could be kind of the young person that Kate Beckinsale was when she first started this franchise, and potentially lead it from there. My question really is whether or not this was just enough of a success that they're not going to let it actually slip by them and do another one, especially with everything that they can gain going forward with potentially the other stuff they talked about with a new television show and maybe even spin-offs and creating a much bigger, broader world with the kind of overexposure or blowing up of a cinematic universe. It would be actually really interesting to kind of explore this world in particular, because it's always been kind of interesting. What started as kind of a gothic, Romeo and Juliet story, or, for most people, Twilight before Twilight, like a grown-up Twilight before Twilight. I think that's what it really kind of ended up being. I think it's really interesting. I would really like to continue going forward, kind of exploring this world more and more in the next coming films. So if they do this, I definitely think it's going to be Eve's character basically taking up the forefront with Kate Beckinsale if she decides to return, not being the central figure, not being a central protagonist, but kind of a mentor to her daughter as everything basically plays out that way. And I don't necessarily know what they're going to be facing. I think we've been basically up against a wall with this franchise for the longest time about what they could potentially be doing, considering the fact that they took out all the originals, original vampire, original werewolf, and all this other stuff. Maybe introduce something else. I mean, introduce a mummy, introduce something like, introduce a new antagonist. They've done humans, they've done werewolves, they've done vampires, they've done new and different amazing things. Maybe it's time for something else. And there's a whole lot of mythology out there that they could be kind of grasping at in like reintroducing or introducing into this world. So maybe I'll do a video about that. Any antagonizing forces I'd really like to see in a new Underworld movie if they ever decide to make one. But with that being said, I want everyone to go down to the comment section below and share your thoughts and opinions about this, and like, what do you think about an Underworld 6? Do you think that they should make it? Who do you think should be the central figure in that film? Should Kate Beckinsale return? And anything that you can basically think of in this entire subject, because I honestly kind of want to just have this conversation with you guys. So with that being said, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Share this video out to all your friends, and I'm going to catch you on the next video. Do not forget to click that bell over by the subscriber button for more notifications anytime I upload. Bye, guys.